January 14, 1945. Near the snow-dusted perimeter of a Luftwaffe forward operating base. The morning air is brittle, silent except for the rhythmic cough of a Junkers Jumo engine struggling to life. A German pilot, his breath blooming in the cold, settles into the cockpit of an Mi-109. He believes he is safe within the shadow of the Ardennes. Then, the horizon vibrates. It isn't the high-altitude drone of the B-17s. It is a low-pitched, guttural roar that seems to tear the very fabric of the sky. Suddenly, for silhouettes crest the tree-lean, massive, radial-engine P-47 Thunderbolts. They do not drop bombs. Instead, from under their wings, long tubes ignite with a blinding, magnesium-white flash. The sound is a terrifying, supersonic hiss, the scream of M8 rockets cutting through the air at over 800 feet per second. In a heartbeat, the runway becomes a furnace. The Mi-109 is not shot down. It is erased. This was no longer a dogfight. It was an execution from the air, and for the pilots of the Third Reich, the ground had become the most dangerous place in the world. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe had undergone a fundamental shift in physics and philosophy. The era of the lone, chivalrous dogfight was dead, replaced by a brutal war of attrition that the Luftwaffe was systematically losing. For years, the German High Command had relied on the superior climb rates of their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to intercept Allied heavies at 30,000 feet. But as the invasion of Normandy loomed, the Allied strategy shifted. It was no longer enough to merely protect the bombers. The objective was now the total dehousing of the German Air Force. General P. Spatz and Jimmy Doolittle unleashed their fighters from the rigid constraints of close bomber escort, giving them a new, predatory mandate: find the enemy and kill him wherever he hides. This directive pushed the American fighters lower and lower. While the P-51 Mustang became the celebrated long-range assassin of the upper atmosphere, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug by its pilots, found its true calling in the thick, oxygen-rich air just above the treetops. The Thunderbolt was a 7-ton beast of burden, built around the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine. It was an aircraft that did not so much fly as it bullied the air into submission. Its ruggedness was legendary, while liquid-cooled engines like those in the Mustang or the German Mi-109 would seize if a single coolant line was nicked. The P-47's air-cooled radial could take 20mm cannon fire to its cylinders and still limp back to base. As 1944 progressed, in 1945, the German Air Arm was forced into a desperate shell game. Because the Allied oil campaign had decimated their fuel supplies, German pilots could no longer afford to spend hours patrolling the skies. Instead, they were kept on the ground, tucked away in camouflage revetments, waiting for the precise moment to scramble against incoming raids. The Luftwaffe had turned its airfields into fortresses, ringed with dense concentrations of 20mm and 37mm flak guns. They believed that beneath this umbrella of steel, their precious fighters were safe. They were wrong. The Americans had realized that a fighter destroyed on the ground was just as dead as one shot out of the clouds, and much easier to hit if you had the right tools. The introduction of the point-blank directive meant that every German airfield within reach of the 9th Air Force was now a primary target. However, traditional skip bombing and strafing had their limitations. Strafing with .50 caliber machine guns required a long, steady dive, a predictable flight path that made the P-47 a sitting duck for German flak crews. Dropping iron bombs required precision that was difficult to achieve at 400 miles per hour while under fire. The solution to this tactical deadlock would come in the form of a weapon borrowed from the artillerymen: the rocket. By mounting triple-tube M8 launchers or high-velocity aircraft rockets, VARs, onto the massive wings of the Thunderbolt, the Americans created a flying battery capable of delivering the punch of a heavy cruiser's broadside with the precision of a sniper. This evolution turned the P-47 into the most feared ground attack platform of the war. For the German pilots, sitting in their cockpits on the tarmac, the sight of a jug pulling out a cloud bank was no longer just a threat to their mission. It was a death sentence. The psychological impact of rocket warfare was immediate. Unlike the staccato rhythm of machine guns, a rocket volley was a singular, earth-shaking event. It was a weapon of shock and awe that bypassed the traditional defenses of the Luftwaffe, striking with such velocity that by the time a pilot heard the roar of the incoming engine, the hangar behind him was already collapsing in a sheet of flame. The sanctuary of the airfield had been violated, and the Luftwaffe found itself trapped between a sky they could no longer control and a ground that was being systematically incinerated. The transformation of the P-47 from an escort fighter to a ground attack specialist was not merely a change in mission. It was a feat of engineering necessity. To understand why German pilots feared the rocket jug more than any other Allied aircraft, one must look at the sheer physical presence of the machine. The Republic P-47 was the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the era. If the Mustang was a rapier, the Thunderbolt was a sledgehammer. At its maximum takeoff weight, a fully loaded P-47D weighed over 8 tons, more than the twin-engine German Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. This mass allowed it to dive at speeds that would cause the wings of other fighters to snap, providing a stable platform for high-velocity weaponry. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force had perfected the art of armed reconnaissance. The strategy was simple but devastating. Groups of P-47s would range deep behind German lines, looking for targets of opportunity. While tanks and supply trains were high priority, nothing was more prized than a hidden Luftwaffe airfield. The German strategy of decentralization, had moved aircraft into forest clearings and onto stretches of the Autobahn to escape the heavy bombers. However, the Thunderbolt's endurance and ruggedness allowed it to loiter at low altitudes, hunting for the telltale signs of these secret bases, fresh tire tracks in the mud, or the glimmer of a glass canopy through pine needles. The introduction of the M8 4.5-inch rocket changed the math of these encounters. Originally designed for ground-to-ground fire, these rockets were adapted for the air by mounting them in bazooka-style triple tubes under each wing. Unlike the P-51, which had a narrower wing profile, the P-47's massive wing area could carry these bulky tubes without compromising its flight characteristics. When a P-47 pilot lined up on a row of parked FW-190s, he wasn't just firing bullets. He was launching miniature artillery shells. The rockets traveled at nearly 600 miles per hour, making them almost impossible to intercept with small arms fire or light flak. Furthermore, the Thunderbolt was a flying bathtub of armor. The pilot sat behind a massive radial engine that acted as a 3-foot-thick steel shield. The fuselage was built with a heavy-duty internal keel that allowed it to survive belly landings on rough terrain that would have crumpled any other aircraft. This meant P-47 pilots could afford to stay in the danger zone of low-level flak longer than their counterparts. They would orbit a German base, systematically dismantling its defenses with their 8.50 caliber machine guns, before rolling in for the final, thunderous rocket run. This tactical evolution created a paradox for the German high command. To defend their bases, they needed to keep their fighters ready to scramble. But to keep them ready, they had to expose them on the tarmac. The moment a German pilot stepped onto the wing of his aircraft, he was entering a lottery of survival. The P-47s would often time their strikes for the changeover, the window when one German squadron was landing and another was preparing to take off. In this state, the German planes were at their most vulnerable, low on fuel, low on altitude, or stationary on ground. The Jug didn't just fight the Luftwaffe, it preyed upon it, turning the once mighty German airfields into slaughterhouses of burning magnesium and high-octane fuel. To understand the terror these strikes instilled, one must first look through the gun sight of the American pilot, the kinetic hunter. For the men of the 362nd or 405th Fighter Groups, flying the P-47 was an exercise in managed violence. Sitting behind the massive R-2800 engine, The pilot felt every vibration of the 2,000 horsepower pulling him through the thick European air. When diving toward a German airfield, the P-47 didn't twitch or drift. Its immense weight gave it the stability of a freight train. The pilot would thumb the selector switch from guns to rockets, a transition that shifted the mission from suppression to annihilation. They were trained to pickle the rockets in pairs or a full salvo of 6. As the trigger was squeezed, the aircraft would momentarily shudder, obscured by a massive plume of white smoke as the M8S ignited. Unlike a bomb, which fell with gravity, the rocket sought its target with a flat, terrifying trajectory. It was the ultimate point-and-click weapon of the 1940s, allowing a pilot to snipe a reinforced hangar from half a mile away, well outside the most lethal range of light machine gun nests. The second angle is the technological breakthrough of the high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVR, nicknamed the Holy Moses. If the M8 was a repurposed artillery shell, the HVR was a purpose-built monster. 5 inches in diameter and carrying the explosive power of a 105mm howitzer shell, it was designed to penetrate the thick concrete of Luftwaffe revetments. The HVR moved at 1,300 feet per second, faster than the speed of sound. For the German ground crews, this meant the weapon arrived before the noise of its flight. There was no whistle of an incoming bomb to warn them to dive into a trench. There was only the sight of the P-47's wings erupting in flame, followed instantly by the supersonic crack of the rocket passing overhead and the thunderous eruption of the target. This was the magnesium flash, a technological leap that rendered the traditional sandbagged walls of a German airfield as useless as paper. These rockets did more than just explode. They created a psychological vacuum. The P-47 was a massive target, yet it seemed impervious to the paper-cutter 20mm flak that usually shredded Allied fighters. This resilience, combined with the sheer volume of fire from 8.50 caliber machine guns and a dozen rockets, gave the Thunderbolt an almost supernatural aura. Allied pilots reported seeing German flak crews simply abandon their guns and run for the woods the moment they saw the Jug level out its wings for a rocket run. They knew that once those tubes were aimed, the geometry of the battlefield had already been decided. The American pilot wasn't just dropping ordnance. He was rewriting the laws of low-level engagement, turning the P-47 into a legendary engine of destruction that bridged the gap between traditional dogfighting and modern air-to-ground precision. The third angle focuses on the perspective of the German pilot, the prey. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a force of contradictions, possessing advanced jet technology like the Me-262, but lacking the fuel and safety to deploy it. For a German pilot, the Jug represented a terrifying omnipresence. To even start the engine of an Me-109 was to ring a dinner bell for patrolling P-47s. German veterans later recounted the Thunderbolt fever that gripped their ranks, the knowledge that at any moment, while they were strapped into their seats and unable to maneuver, a rocket could turn their cockpit into a funeral pyre. This wasn't the honorable combat of 1940. This was industrial-scale assassination. The rockets, with their flat trajectories, could skip into the open mouths of hangars or pierce the reinforced boxes where planes were serviced. The fear was so pervasive that German pilots began to view their own airfields as targets rather than sanctuaries, often choosing to bail out of damaged aircraft over open fields rather than risk a landing at a base under the constant watch of the Jabos, the German nickname for the Allied fighter bombers. Finally, we must examine the tactical angle, the armed reconnaissance doctrine that empowered this terror. Unlike the Royal Air Force, which often conducted specialized night raids or heavy bombing sorties, the American 9th Air Force gave its P-47 pilots immense autonomy. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts, led by a veteran with just a few hundred hours of combat time, had the authority to deviate from their flight path to work over any German installation they discovered. This created a chaotic, unpredictable environment for the German defenders. There was no schedule to the terror. A base could be quiet at 0900 and a smoking ruin by 0915. The P-47s would often use cloverleaf patterns, one pair of aircraft diving to suppress the flak guns with their machine guns, while the second pair followed immediately behind to deliver the killing blow with rockets. This doctrine turned the P-47 into a psychological weapon as much as a kinetic one. The German High Command tried to counter this by moving flak batteries onto the roofs of hangars or hiding guns in haystacks. But the P-47's rockets allowed the Americans to stand off at distances where the German 20mm fire was ineffective. The Jug could loiter for hours, its massive fuel tanks and rugged engine allowing it to wait out the enemy. This tactical patience, combined with the devastating explosive power of the HVR, meant that the Luftwaffe was being systematically choked to death on its own soil. The rocket Jug didn't just destroy planes. It destroyed the German pilots to even attempt a takeoff, effectively grounded the Luftwaffe through sheer, unadulterated dread. The tension of the air war reached its breaking point during the winter of 1944 and the opening weeks of 1945. The German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had relied on thick fog and low ceilings to keep the Allied air forces grounded. But when the Bluebird weather returned in late December, the P-47s of the 9th Air Force descended like a plague. The climax of this terror began as the P-47s transitioned from opportunistic hunters to systematic executioners. On every clear day, hundreds of Thunderbolts, each bristling with HVR Holy Moses rockets, swept across the Rhineland. They weren't just looking for convoys. They were looking for the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots, desperate to reclaim the skies, attempted a final, massive gamble, Operation Bodenplatte. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched over 800 aircraft in a surprise low-level strike against Allied airfields. While they achieved initial success, the operation was a Pyrrhic victory that exhausted their remaining pilot reserves and fuel. More importantly, it revealed the exact locations of the hidden forest bases the Germans had been using. In the days following Bodenplatte, the Americans didn't just retaliate. They launched a campaign of total erasure. P-47 groups, such as the 365th Hellhawks, began a series of stationary interdictions. They would orbit a known German airfield, such as the one at Darmstadt or Frankfurt-Born, and wait. When the German flak crews opened fire, they gave away their positions. The P-47s would roll into 60-degree dives, pushing their airspeed toward 500 miles per hour. This was the moment of maximum terror for the German personnel below. From the ground, the sight of a P-47 inking its target was unmistakable. The massive fighter would level out, and suddenly, the wings would disappear behind a wall of white smoke and orange flame. The M8 and HVR rockets would streak forward, covering the distance in less than 2 seconds. At the base at Gross Ostium, German pilots described the sound as the sky cracking open. The rockets didn't just puncture the thin aluminum of the parked planes, they vaporized the structures housing them. A single HVR strike on a hangar could ignite the fuel stores of an entire squadron, creating a chain reaction of explosions that no fire crew could hope to contain. The Americans had refined their technique into a lethal science. They would ripple their rockets, firing them in rapid succession to walk the explosions across a line of parked Mi-109s. Because the rockets were fin-stabilized and launched at high speeds, they had the penetration power to go through 3 feet of reinforced earth and timber. German pilots who had spent the morning carefully camouflaging their aircraft with pine branches watched in horror as the jabs simply blew the forest floor apart. The sanctuary of the woods had become a trap, and the P-47 was the key that locked it. As the winter of 1945 bled into spring, the Luftwaffe's situation shifted from desperate to apocalyptic. The Germans had attempted to hide their remaining strength in walled lager, forest camps, where Mi-262 jets and high-performance FW-190DS were tucked under the canopy of the dense German woods. They believed the P-47s could not hit what they could not see. But the American pilots had developed a terrifyingly effective counter-tactic: area saturation. If they saw a single aircraft track leading into a cluster of trees, they would treat the entire forest as a target. In one notable engagement near the airfield at Kirkburg, a flight of Thunderbolt from a 362nd Fighter Group spotted the telltale shimmer of heat rising from the trees, the signature of a jet engine warming up. The P-47s did not circle for a better look. They dove. Using their HVR rockets, they performed tree-topping runs. The 5-inch rockets acted like massive chainsaws, shearing through ancient oaks and elms before detonating against the hidden hangars below. The German pilots, sitting in their cockpits and waiting for the order to scramble, found themselves in a nightmare of falling timber and supersonic shrapnel. There was no time to bail out, no time to fight back. The rocket's high-explosive warheads turned the forest into a pressurized oven, incinerating everything within the revetments. The climax reached its peak during the final big week of tactical air operations. The P-47s began carrying a lethal cocktail: 2 500-pound bombs and 6 to 10 HVR rockets. This combination allowed them to crack and cook their targets. The bombs would shatter the heavy concrete roofing of the German bunkers, and the rockets would be fired directly into the exposed interior. At the base at Biblis, this technique resulted in the destruction of nearly 30 German fighters in a single afternoon. German ground crews, usually resilient, began to desert their posts during these raids. The sheer kinetic energy of the P-47's arrival, the sound of the 8.50 caliber guns joined by the staccato roar of the rockets, created a shock effect that paralyzed the defense. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively a non-entity. The German pilots were no longer terrified of losing a dogfight. They were terrified of the very act of sitting in an airplane. Every runway in Germany was under constant 24-hour surveillance by cab ranks of P-47s. The moment a German hangar door creaked open, a Thunderbolt would roll in from the sun, rockets already igniting. The Jug had successfully moved the front line from the borders of Germany to the very cockpit of every German fighter. The war in the air hadn't ended in a grand aerial battle. It ended with the hissing of spent rocket tubes and the crackle of burning German aluminum on the runways of the Reich. When the smoke finally cleared over the shattered remains of the Reich's airfields, the scale of the devastation was staggering. The rocket jugs had achieved what years of high-altitude bombing had struggled to perfect: the total paralysis of a modern air force. Intelligence officers from the Allied Air Force reconstruction units, following closely behind the advancing infantry, found scenes that defied traditional military logic. At airfields like Fritzlar and Handorf, they didn't find a few charred wrecks. They found entire wings of the Luftwaffe, meant to be the final line of defense for Berlin, reduced to mangled heaps of steel and melted plexiglass. The statistical reality of the P-47's rocket campaign was a grim testament to industrial warfare. In the final year of the war, P-47 Thunderbolts were credited with the destruction of over 86,000 railway cars, 6,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 4,000 aircraft on the ground. However, it was the ground-kill ratio that told the true story of German terror. By 1945, for every German aircraft shot down in a dogfight, 3 or 4 were being obliterated in their revetments by rocket fire. The HVR and M8 rockets had proven to be 400% more effective at destroying reinforced structures than traditional strafing. The aftermath was not just measured in metal, but in the total collapse of the German pilot training pipeline. Because the P-47s had targeted the airfields so relentlessly, the Luftwaffe could no longer safely train new recruits. Airfields were no longer schools, they were graveyards. Even the legendary experts, the high-scoring German aces, found their records meant nothing when their planes were vaporized before the wheels could even retract. The psychological reports from captured German personnel revealed a phenomenon they called Jabo angst, fighter-bomber anxiety. It was a form of shell shock unique to the air crews, a realization that the technology of the Thunderbolt had rendered their skill, their courage, and their planes entirely obsolete. The Luftwaffe hadn't just been defeated, it had been evicted from its own home. The logistical consequences of the Thunderbolts' rocket rain forced the German high command into a state of primitive desperation. In the final months, the once sophisticated infrastructure of the Luftwaffe had been pushed into the shadows. Because any open runway was a magnet for P-47s, the Germans were forced to utilize the Reichsautobahn as makeshift airstrips. They painted the concrete green and moved planes into the surrounding woods under heavy camouflage netting. Yet, even these measures failed. American pilots, now experts at spotting the unnatural lines of hidden bases from 5,000 feet, would use their rockets to set the surrounding forests on fire, flushing the hidden aircraft out or simply burying them under burning debris. The destruction of the ground facilities also meant the end of the Me-262's potential. While the German jet was faster than anything in the Allied inventory, it required long, smooth runways and immense amounts of fuel, both of which were prime targets for rocket-toting P-47s. Allied intruder missions became so effective that German jets were often destroyed while still on their transport trailers. The rocket jug had effectively severed the connection between the factory and the front line. Captured documents from the Oberkommando der Luftwaffe, OKL, revealed that by March 1945, nearly 60% of all aircraft losses were attributed to ground attack missions rather than aerial combat. The German strategy of defense of the Reich had collapsed because the defense had no place to stand. Furthermore, the technological shift toward rockets during this period changed the nature of military aviation forever. The success of the HVAR on the P-47 proved that a single-seat fighter could deliver the punch of a heavy bomber with surgical precision. This realization led to the immediate post-war development of specialized ground attack aircraft. The P-47 had demonstrated that the future of air power wasn't just in the clouds, but in the ability to project power directly onto the enemy's doorstep. For the German people living near these bases, the war ended not with a bang, but with the persistent, terrifying hiss of rockets, a sound that signaled the final, violent transition from a world of traditional warfare to one of high-velocity, industrial destruction. The roar of the R-2800 engine has long since faded from the European skies, but the echoes of the P-47's rocket runs still resonate in the doctrine of modern air warfare. The Thunderbolts' transition from a high-altitude interceptor to a low-level juggernaut represents more than just a tactical shift. It was the birth of the modern multi-role fighter. Before the P-47 and its Holy Moses rockets, the division between the air and the ground was a rigid line. The Jug didn't just cross that line, it obliterated it. It proved that a pilot's greatest weapon was not necessarily his ability to outturn an opponent in a dogfight, but his ability to deny the enemy the safety of the earth itself. History often remembers the glamorous duels of the Mustang or the Spitfire, but it was the gritty, low-level violence of the P-47 that truly broke the spine of the Luftwaffe. The terror felt by German pilots was not born of a lack of courage, but from the realization that they were fighting a ghost, a weapon that moved faster than sound, hit with the force of a tank, and appeared without warning from the tree line. It was a cold, industrial reality that signaled the end of the Knights of the Air and the beginning of the era of total air supremacy. Today, the spirit of the rocket jug lives on in the A-10 Warthog and the F-35, aircraft designed to dominate the battlefield from the mud up. We look back at those winter mornings in 1945, not just to catalog the destruction, but to understand the moment when the sky became a permanent vantage point of judgment. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the instrument of that judgment, a 7-ton testament to the fact that in modern war, there is no sanctuary, no hiding place, and no defense against a hunter that carries the lightning in its wings. The German pilots who survived those strikes never forgot the sound, the supersonic hiss that meant the world was about to end. It remains a haunting reminder that the ultimate victory in war is often won not by the fastest or the most agile, but by the most relentless.